Well, I think people are going to drift in and drift out in the course of the afternoon, and so I think we'll just make this a very informal conversation. And I'm going to begin by a few thoughts that I have looking back at this story that took place 30 plus years ago and involved me to some extent. One is about the current view of the mafia, and the other is about the writing of history. Three or four well-known journalists have written about Robert Kennedy and the Justice Department in the same era and story that I've written about. Ronald Steele did, Arthur Schlesinger did, Evan Thomas from Newsweek recently, Cy Hirsch. And it's interesting that we have all taken the same facts and the same story and written different books and drawn different conclusions from the same facts, quote-unquote facts, which raises the question about what is a fact and whether the writing of biography tells as much about the author and the writer as it does about the subject of the biography. One interesting thing about my experience is that I was going to write this book in 1966, right after I'd left the Justice Department, when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General and when all of this was very fresh. And he was going to write the foreword to it, and it was going to be a very current history of the experience we'd all had in the new frontier. I, at the same time, had been offered a contract to write another book on another subject about bail reform, and I wasn't sure which one I wanted to do. It seemed to me this was the time to write the story of our recent experiences. And I went to New York and talked to a young editor there who I'd been introduced to and asked for his advice. He was with Dial Press at the time, and he said, no, by all means you should write the bail book. Nobody else is going to write that book. You need time to write this history. You should wait a period of time before you do that. I didn't agree, really, and I didn't quite understand why he thought that. It seemed to me you write something when it's fresh and you get a better vision. But for whatever reason, I did write the book about bail, and then Robert Kennedy was killed, and obviously wasn't going to write the foreword, and I put that one away and thought I would never write it until many years later, when a lot of the people who were in the Justice Department at that time came together at the time of an HBO film about Robert Kennedy and said, you know, you really should write that book. People are dying, and it's a great story. It was one of the highlights of the New Frontier, and you should do it. And so I did, and the interesting thing is so many disclosures came about mostly as a result of the Church Committee hearings in the 70s about things that were going on in the Justice Department while I was there, but about which I had no knowledge, that in fact it was a different book than I might have written at the time. It was harder to go back and find some people. I even had difficulty finding the trial records of the court proceedings in my own cases, but I did find them. But the interesting thing is that we found out through the Church Committee and other investigative reports that had come out since then that things were going on at the department that I didn't know about, particularly with regard to Fidel Castro, attempts to use the mafia to assassinate Castro, and using the very people, in some cases, that we were prosecuting and investigating. So the interesting PS is that the editor at Dial Press, who gave me this advice, was Ed Doctorow, went on to become the great novelist of our time. And he was right, even though I didn't think so at the time. It is a very different book. And it was a tricky book to write because one doesn't want to make it too autobiographical because people aren't so much interested in knowing what I was doing in 1964, but they're keenly and endlessly interested in knowing what Robert Kennedy was doing. And, you know, there is a Chinese saying, may we live in interesting times. Those were very interesting times. They were very exciting times. The Kennedys brought a lot of glamour to the Department of Justice. Working in the government in those days was exciting, very interesting, and in a way that seems almost out of place nowadays, altruistic. People weren't there to learn about the government so they could go out and cash in and work for a law firm and make a lot of money. The people were there because they were turned on by what different people in the administration were doing, particularly Robert Kennedy, also Sergeant Shriver and the work that he did in the Peace Corps, drew out the best in young people. And even today, I represent Shriver, who's writing his memoir. When I meet young people who are in the Peace Corps, their eyes glisten about what it was then, and there is still that same feeling of commitment and wanting to serve the country that I don't think you see now in government, and I don't think you see in administrations since the Kennedy years. So I'm glad I waited. I'm glad I wrote the book, and there are a lot of interesting things that happened then. I think the moment of the assassination of JFK is a time that everybody who's alive remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing. And that chapter in this book, I think, is a particularly interesting one because we were actually in a meeting in Robert Kennedy's office at the time that the assassination took place. He didn't know it, but we had been having one of our regular meetings to discuss our cases with him. We broke for lunch, and then, of course, he went to Hickory Hill with guests from New York, Robert Morgenthau. We went back to our offices, and then we all learned what had happened. And to me, the incredible point of what happened is that while we didn't know it at the time, I think the work that we were doing fighting organized crime is what led to the assassination of JFK. After the Warren Committee issued its report, Johnson said as much, Robert Kennedy said as much privately to people he knew, and the House Assassination Committee, which looked into it, concluded as much, that it was Trafficante and Marcello and Jimmy Hoffa who had paid to set up others to work with Oswald, and that in leading this charge that he did, Robert Kennedy and the organized crime section had opened a Pandora's box, thought they could burn their candle at both ends, and both work with the mafia at the same time that we were harassing them and prosecuting them and investigating them and making their lives miserable. And as a result, I think he went to his own death thinking that he had been the cause of his brother's death. I'm not going to read from this book. I hope you all will read it yourselves, but if any of you have questions about particular aspects of those times, I'm happy to answer those questions and talk about what might be on your minds. And if not, that's okay too.
Tell about why you first came to Washington and what your views about working for Kennedy were at that time.
Well, that's a story that you know, but I was a young lawyer and was not very high on Robert Kennedy in 1961. I had supported Stevenson, thought the Kennedys were kind of pushy, thought Robert Kennedy had been an excessive prosecutor when he ran the McClellan Committee hearings, and had great reticence about him being Attorney General. I thought then, I think now, that at the time he became Attorney General, he had no qualifications to be Attorney General. He'd never practiced law. He didn't know anything except labor racketeering, which is why he came to the Justice Department with organized crime being his main interest. I also think that in the years he was Attorney General, he grew exponentially. He did even after he left the Attorney Generalship. And at the time of his death, it was a far different man and was evolving into a great leader who was unique in our history. And had he lived, probably would have been president. And we probably all would have been living in a very different world. I don't think there would have been a Vietnam War. There surely wouldn't have been Watergate. There wouldn't have been a lot of the cynicism we now have about race, which is still a problem in this country. He had a credibility with white-collar people. He had a credibility with blue-collar working class people, had a credibility with the black community. He was a tough prosecutor at the same time that he was a soulful man who was touched by the problems of farm workers and hunger in Mississippi and things of that nature, and these people believed in him, and so he had an interesting combination of support that was unique and I don't think equaled in the years since. So I came, I thought, for a year, stayed for much longer, and changed my mind dramatically during those years working for him. Stayed in the Justice Department the whole time he was there, and went to New York as a speechwriter when he ran for the Senate. Left the government thinking that there would be a time to come back, that we were going to be seeing him again in higher office, and never had that opportunity. Yeah.
Ron, going back to something you said in your introduction, and I'm perhaps misunderstood, was there a connection established, I'm trying to dredge back from years ago to remember, a connection established between Oswald and organized crime?
Oswald had connections with Ruby. It's been documented. I don't think Oswald sat in meetings with mafia folks. I think he was the patsy he said he was, and was used. I think there is absolutely no question that Oswald did not act alone, and whether he was used as a dupe or was innocently used, and so that the mob, in setting up the killing of Kennedy, wouldn't be seen to have done that. In any event, he was not acting alone. I think from the very moment, the first book after the assassination by Edward J. Epstein, I think obliterated the single bullet theory. The conclusion of the House Assassinations Committee with their acoustical experts shows pretty clearly that that there were other shooters. I don't think Oswald knew those shooters. I don't think even that he necessarily knew that they were there, but they were there. But it was set up that I think that Oswald was recruited by Ruby and knocked off by Ruby, so that he couldn't present any evidence. And there have been a lot of books that have been written since, including one by a woman who had access to Cuban security files, which concluded the same.
Did you address this in your book? I hadn't read it yet.
I have a chapter on that, which is why I was saying before, had I written this book in 1966, I never would have written the book I did. To me, the strangest thing of all is, if in fact Giancana and Marcello and Trafficante and these people were behind the killing of Kennedy, how could it be that he was pressing them at the same time? If we were using the mob, as it's clear we were, in the anti-Castro escapades, how did we think we were going to get away with it when we indicted these people? You know, Giancana was represented by Edward Bennett Williams, and if in fact they had this chip they could use, Williams would have presented it. But I know from having sat in on meetings that we were avid about going after Giancana and all of the others. We know fairly definitely from wiretaps that have been made public in the years since then, and which some of which were in the report of the Church Committee, that there were conversations between Hoffa, Trafficante, and others about whacking out Kennedy. The first plan was to kill Robert Kennedy, and there's evidence and testimony and wiretaps of conversations between the alleged shooter, Parton was his name, from Louisiana, and Hoffa, about shooting Robert Kennedy. And then the mafia said, well, if you do that and the president is still the president, then we're going to have the Marines and everybody in the world after us. You can't, if you want to kill the snake, you can't chop off its tail, you got to chop off its head. And the assassination plan switched from a plan to kill Robert Kennedy to a plan to kill Jack Kennedy, which is what happened. And again, there are wiretaps and conversations. There's a book by Trafficante and Hoffa's lawyer, a guy named Regano, in which he said that Hoffa said, you got to get you got to go to your people, go to Trafficante. You got to tell them we've got to get this guy off our back. We've got to kill him. And then after the assassination, they're saying to Regano, go back and tell your guy he owes us, and he owes us big. And the next thing you know, there's a Teamster loan to Marcello from the Teamster pension fund. I'm only giving you a few of them, but to say that this is not just the surmise of conspiracy theorists I'm talking about, but an extraordinary amount of circumstantial evidence, admissions by people themselves, which would be admissible in court if there was a trial now, including Marcello, Trafficante, Regano, Parton, Hoffa, and others, about the plan to do this. Even if that never happened, even if that plan never happened because an isolated act by Oswald intervened and the mafia stepped back and said, wow, we don't have to do it, there was still a conspiracy to kill the president. And there were overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. So that as a former prosecutor, I would say there was enough evidence to have brought a conspiracy case against him, even if there was no connection at all between Oswald and people in the mob, though I think there was.
Why was it never done?
Why was it never done?
Conspiracy.
Well, I mean, first of all, at the time, the Warren Commission reached its conclusions because the Warren Commission was basing its conclusions on the evidence that was presented to it. They had the FBI and the CIA, both of which were feathering their own nest in terms of what they wanted to be made public and what would be embarrassing to them. There was no way, and the CIA had a member of the Warren Commission, so the Warren Commission was acting like McNamara was acting about Vietnam. Bright people taking the evidence before them, drawing a perfectly appropriate conclusion, but if the evidence is wrong, you draw the wrong conclusions. So the Warren Commission didn't have the information. Subsequently, different people were dead, and Giancana was killed shortly before he testified before the House Assassination Committee, shot in the neck and mouth, which is the mafia's way of saying you'll never speak again. And Trafficante died. Hoffa was in prison. Hoffa and Marcello tried to bribe witnesses to get Hoffa out of prison and say that the testimony against him was false. So the people were never together at the same time that the evidence was accumulated, and the evidence still continues to build. We'll probably never have the decisive evidence that we might have. It'll be interesting to see when Fidel Castro dies, and those records are completely made public. Some have been, to see what would happen. But there were these plots and plans going on right up until the very moment of the assassination. Somebody from the CIA was meeting in Paris with a Cuban who they were using to kill Castro. And 3 days before the assassination, Castro said to an AP reporter at a meeting in Havana, I know that they're trying to get me, and if they get me, their leaders are going to be gotten as well. So all of this stuff was going on roughly at the same time, but none of it was known when the Warren Commission issued its reports.
Do you think the Warren Commission report did the best job they could have, or?
Yeah, I knew the people who were working. I think they were earnest. I don't think.
You didn't think there were efforts to draw foregone conclusions?
I think the CIA representative and the FBI sources of information were controlled by Hoover and Helms at the CIA, and they knew a handful of people at CIA, very few, knew what it was that they were doing. There was no way in the world that was going to come out then.
Well, because didn't the commission decide that Oswald acted
alone
by himself?
Yes.
And their timetables, as I recall, are completely askew, getting him across town and under tunnels to the movie theater at a mock pace, with a police car behind him that wouldn't have known to pick him up. It reads
They were in a
Poorly.
they were in a rush. Johnson didn't want the world to perceive this country as coming apart because a popular, internationally popular president had been killed. So he quickly convened these people and tried a group that would have a lot of credibility and told them to get this thing done and to, as well as possible, not to dissemble, but to get it done so that it could be behind this country, that we were all grieving, people were mystified. You have to remember that now, those of us now who've lived the last 30 or 40 years have seen the Pope shot, we've seen Martin Luther King shot, we've seen Kennedy killed. These things seem commonplace in a nasty world that we live in. At the time, it was unthinkable. It was like unimaginable. And so there was a great concern in bringing the country to some composure and to have the international community know that things were in charge and this country wasn't in chaos. So ideally, and not for bad purposes, there was a rush to get this thing done. And the very committee was relying for its information on sources which weren't going to give them the evidence that they knew. And also, it wasn't until later on that some of these things ever came to light. So I think they probably came out with an earnest conclusion. And I think now there's a vested interest in keeping the case closed and not going back. People say, you know, to what purpose should we open this? You know, what do we gain by it? There have been something like 2,000 books written about it. One hesitates to crawl into that thicket because a lot of them are bizarre notions. But if you sort through the evidence, it's hard to conclude that it's impossible to conclude, I think, that Oswald was acting alone. I have seen the Zapruder film. One of my partners represented them, and I actually sat and watched the actual film of it. And you look at that, and you can't believe that it was one person acting alone. You see him going like this. You see him going back. If you see the real thing, as opposed to the few segments that most people have seen, it's almost impossible. And then when you put that together with the acoustical evidence that the House Assassination Committee came up with, and the circumstantial evidence of the 5 people who were interviewed, the later evidence that comes from the Cuban records, from the CIA records that have been disclosed, the wiretaps that were put together by the House Assassination Committee, all of it builds a kind of circumstantial evidence that I think is irresistibly points to the conclusion that there were more people than Oswald there, and those people were either the mob or Cubans who were being used by the mob.
Don't you think there's some value, though, in having the American population say or believe in a more common way that Oswald didn't act alone? If you ask the person on the street who killed Kennedy, the person will probably say Oswald. But given all this evidence and given all the reports that are available to people and the voice that hides in so many people's heads, it was impossible he acted alone, no matter who his partners were. Don't you think it's valuable for people to ultimately say Kennedy was killed by Oswald and other people?
I think if we had a little more decisive information about who those others are, it would probably make sense, even at this late date, for some Blue Ribbon Commission or Joint Congressional Investigatory Group. There was an Assassination Records Committee that met a few years ago, and when further records were opened up. But some of the family, because of the family, there are some records that aren't going to be open until 50 years after Kennedy was killed, which is getting a little close. So I think it's, as remote as it is, I think it is possible still that there might be some kind of proceeding. It's not going to be a trial, but it might be a hearing that would complete the historical record. And when that's done, I think it's going to be clear that that it was more than Oswald alone.
What's the main difference between fighting organized crime in 1963 or 4 and fighting it today? Would he do the same? But is it the same process, just different tools, or has it changed qualitatively in some way?
It's changed, but it's not so dissimilar. I just finished reading a book about a huge case in New York that's only 2 or 3 years old, involving the waste disposal unions, you know, the sanitation business, which was a huge indictment of over 40 or 50 people. They had some undercover folks, and there was something like it was a $500 million business, and it was run by the mobs all over New York. So it still goes on. The mafia, as it existed in 1960, however, where you really had almost a corporate structure, and jurisdictions divided up, and Marcello running the South, and different people in New York, New England, where they actually met. They had turf identifications of what they were doing. That's not the case now. It's much more, and it's not just the Italian mafia, which does still exist. It is, you have the drug business, which is run by Central and Latin Americans. You've got Vietnamese gangs in California. You've got Russian mafia in New York, and they all have nothing to do with each other. Whereas the organized crime of 1960 really was an organization. One last point I would make before we run out of time, and to me, I'm amused and horrified at the same time by the kind of mythic proportions and acculturation of the mafia nowadays. I don't understand the popularity of The Sopranos. I do understand the amusement of analyze this and analyze that. It's hard not to see that movie and think it's funny, but I don't get The Sopranos. I don't get America thinking that these people are somehow or other these cute folks in the neighborhood. There's no socially redeeming purpose. They're ugly, violent people who are out to corrupt public officials, to destroy institutions, unions, white-collar businesses, or wherever they go. And somehow or other, from the era of The Godfather forward, we've had so many interesting dramatizations of different aspects of the mafia, which are hard to not like. I watched a segment of one of the old Godfathers last night. But the literature has seeped in, and somehow or other, there's been a distance between the literature and fiction of the mafia and the reality. The reality then and the reality now is ugly, unredeemingly so. And I think we forget that at our peril. So thank you all for coming when there's all that good football going on and cocktail parties and whatnot. Nice to see some familiar faces.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.